McCarthyism is the name for a particular moment in American political history, a toxic, really not particularly pleasant moment, in the late 40s and the early 50s, when there was this scare around the rise, the fear that there was a rise in communist influence in America, that the USSR had people infiltrating America. And the person who sort of drove this from the front, Hoover was the guy from behind it, in the shadows. That's a different story. But the guy on the front end of it who wanted the attention and got the attention was the guy whose name is synonymous with this, Joseph McCarthy, the Senator Joseph McCarthy. And so Joseph McCarthy, he starts this scare by holding up this list and saying, I hold in my hands a list of 205, I believe it was, 205 communist sympathizers in the State Department. And people, no, this is scared. And so this starts off, he starts this never-ending roving investigation. He goes to the State Department, and then he goes after people in the entertainment industry, and people are being blacklisted left and right, and people's careers were destroyed by this. It was not good. And then he goes after the Army. He goes after the Army because he finds a dentist. There's an Army dentist who has been promoted without signing the appropriate paperwork to swear that he has not had any socialist leanings in his life. So that begins this hunt that McCarthy goes after the Army, and the Army, no surprise, fights back. And so this leads to what's known as the Army McCarthy hearings, and these are some of the first televised hearings, televised congressional hearings, and they last for 3 months. And they are watched by people around the country. Like people be at home doing the dishes and having the Army McCarthy hearings on in the background. And so at one point, a lawyer comes forward, and he works for the government. He's coming forward, he's testifying as part of the Army McCarthy hearings as what he's doing to help root out the potential, the threat of communism. And part of him coming forward is that he made an agreement with the committee, with Army, with McCarthy. There was this agreement. This lawyer, when he was in law school, had been part of a group that Hoover and the FBI later said had socialist tendencies or leanings, and he said, I'm going to come forward. This has got to be off the table, right? And whether that group actually had socialist leanings is an entirely different. Like, how much do you trust Hoover? A whole different discussion. But the agreement was between Army and McCarthy, this isn't going to come up. And then in the middle of the hearings, McCarthy gets angry, and he wants attention, and he wants to be able to take a swing at this guy. And so he brings it up. And so the lawyer for the United States Army turns and looks at McCarthy on camera, and he utters this line, these two lines that changed the course of American history. He says, have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? And that's it. This rebuke, this call to common decency and how we treat each other was the turning point in McCarthyism. And McCarthy being publicly upbraided for the way he was treating people in front of the television. And so people around the country saw how he had been treating people and that he had broken his word, and just it destroyed his political career. I wonder today, would such a moment have the same impact? Would such a moment matter? Like, you can go back and you can watch it. It's on June 9, 1954. You can go on, look it up on YouTube. Army McCarthy hearings. Have you no decency? You'll find it. And that the sense of shared decency that undergirds something like that the entire sort of the people of America could as one like respond and say, no, this is not decent. Like, is that there today? I don't think it is. I don't think we have the necessary shared common sense of common narrative, common values, common life stories. Right? Last week we began talking about what it means to be ambassadors on behalf of Jesus in such times of fractured, this type of fractured society, fractured culture, such that sort of rebuke, have you no decency, I don't think it would work anymore. And I think that's a sign of how fractured our society has become. And that is a indicator of how much ambassadors are needed. Ambassadors on behalf of Jesus Christ are as needed today as they were when Paul first said this to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 5. He tells them we are ambassadors of the ministry of Jesus Christ, ambassadors of reconciliation, ambassadors to each other. And he's writing this to a church that is at odds with itself and at odds with the community that it is in. And he charges them to be the ones who are the builders of peace, the makers of peace. And so last week we talked about how the first part of being an ambassador, the first essential step, is to be rooted in where you're sent from. Like we talked about, if you're the French ambassador to China, you better be French, right? Better be committed and rooted and deeply French. And as ambassadors on behalf of Jesus, that our first step is to be deeply committed, rooted in what it means to be a follower of Jesus, especially as such practices become less common, become more rare in our society. I mean, just listen to political speech. It used to be in previous decades and generations that political speech often quoted scripture as part of a shared narrative, and now that just doesn't happen. Right, so we are losing the American culture, the sense of common decency, common narrative, common assumptions is fading. It makes us being rooted in who we are as followers of Jesus ever more important. And so while staying rooted in who we are as followers of Jesus is the start, the next part of being an ambassador is standing for something, right? If we're living in a place, in a culture that disagrees with us and we don't stand for something, we're not ambassadors, we're tourists, right? Tourists show up, say, yeah, that's nice, and go home. No, that's not what we're called to be. We're called to be ambassadors, which means that we are engaging with people who disagree with us, who don't have a shared narrative, a shared worldview, right? And choosing what we stand for takes wisdom, because we can't stand for everything. We can't argue about everything, right? There are moments to dig in and say, this is what I have to stand for, and there are moments to be flexible. And I think we continue to look at Daniel as the example of how to do this, because as we looked at last week, like Daniel, they held on to their Jewish diet. We were going to stay Jewish by holding on to our diet, and we're just going to be flexible on naming, like, because they had been renamed. Like Daniel had become Belteshazzar, save the king, and they had been Meshach was a version of the name Mithra, the Babylonian god, right? So Abednego, a servant of Nebo, a Babylonian god of wisdom. And so there's a firmness and there's a flexibility they're exhibiting. And I think it's worth looking a little bit further at them because they lived in this very interesting position. They have been entrusted with positions of great authority in the Babylonian government. Now we read, it's in Daniel 2, 48 to the end of the chapter. It's just a few verses. It's easy to skip over, but we read that the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, made him ruler of the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over the wise men of Babylon. All right, Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So these guys have power. They have authority. And they have a directive from the prophet Jeremiah, a letter from Jeremiah to the Jews in exile, telling them, this is the word of God for you, the Jewish people in exile. You are to build houses and live in them, to plant gardens, eat what they produce, take wives, have sons and daughters, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. And so this combination, right? They have power, and they have this directive to work for the good of the kingdom in which they have been sent. And the kingdom to which they have been sent is the kingdom that destroyed their homeland. Can you imagine how challenging that would be? Like to be sitting there working up like, here, we need to work on some roads so the army can move around efficiently. The army that destroyed the capital of their homeland. That's hard, right? They are charged to act for the good of this city. But they have a lot of reasons not to. How often do you think Daniel and his friends had opinions about what the Babylonians were doing? Think about that. How often do you think Daniel and his three friends had a gut reaction against what Babylon was doing? How often do you think they disagreed with the king's policy, the king who had led the invasion of their homeland? Yet we don't read that they became cantankerous or troublemakers. They were entrusted with authority and power, and they used it for good. There were times they dug in. When they were told, for example, to worship an idol, a statue of the rulers, they said no. And so again, we see this, like they're going to work for the good. They're going to be flexible. There are places they're not going to bend. I think being an ambassador of Jesus today is similar to what Daniel and his friends did. I think that as followers of Jesus, as ambassadors on his behalf, living in 21st century America, we work for the common good. We find projects and causes to stand for. Common good, even as we're frustrated at the greater situation, right? And if you're not frustrated at something in America today, you're not paying attention. I think that's a fairly safe statement to say. Like until really like dwelling on this, I hadn't realized how much I have settled into a pattern of doing what Daniel has did. Like this is, I look at over the last couple of years, I've served our local schools. I'm the president of the PTO at South Shelby Elementary. I've helped out with an open house. I'll open another one over at Monroe City High School. I've worked with local law enforcement to head up building a new jail for the county. I've served as secretary of Shelby County Economic Development on behalf of the local government. And those are just the things that I found to do, to dig in and to make a difference in. Now, having helped with the school, law enforcement, and local government and businesses, does that mean I have agreed with everything that our school, law enforcement, and local government and businesses have done? No, it doesn't. And I don't think I could find anyone who lives in this county or the next county over who agrees with everything that the school, law enforcement, and local government has done, because it doesn't happen. Right? There's always points of dissension and points of disagreement. Yet there are places we can say, this is what we do agree on, so I'll get involved and I'll do this, right? And if I can do this as a city boy transplant, right? And so I do what I can. If I can do it, I know you can do it too, right? You can do it in the places that you can get some leverage on. We can work for the good on what we can agree on, even in the midst of being frustrated with the things that we disagree about. In the same way that Daniel, he did the good he could, even while he had his opinions about what the Babylonian Empire was doing, right? We do what we can, knowing that there are lines that we will not cross. Like Daniel holds on to his diet. We hold on. Jesus is Lord. I'm worshiping on Easter, and there are certain things that I'm going to keep on doing just because that's who I am as a follower of Jesus. To seek a common good whenever and wherever we can, and to work towards that's the work of an ambassador. And I think that building peace, working towards the best and highest goals that we can agree upon, knowing there are places that we disagree on, I think that's a work of imagination. I think that's a work of experimentation. It's a work of listening and questioning and pondering. It's a work of bringing people together and seeing and knowing there are disagreements. Like, and some examples, right? If you bring a pacifist and a militarist and put them in the same room, what can they agree on? One doesn't believe the army should exist or shouldn't be used. Other militarist, someone in the military thinks that we have to have a military. What can they agree on? Well, maybe they can agree upon restrictions on what type of weapons should be used in war. Nothing biological or chemical. Maybe that's a common ground they could work towards together. Maybe, what if you bring someone who is very for gun control and someone who is very for Second Amendment rights. Well, what can they agree upon? Well, maybe they can agree upon people who own guns should have access to gun safety locks so that guns can be stored securely and safely, right, for those who are going to own them. What if you bring people who believe in climate change and people who doubt whether that's happening or not, whether it's man caused, humanity caused, right? What can they agree upon? Maybe they can agree upon solar panels. Like putting more solar panels on the grid is always a good idea. It increases the total amount of production of electricity, right? Like that's a good thing. Find what we can agree on and work towards that. Someone who is pro-choice and pro-life could probably agree that American maternal mortality rates are going up over the last couple of years. Let me say it again to make sure I get it right. American maternal mortality rates, the number of women who die in childbirth, is going up right now. Like, no matter pro-choice or pro-life, I think we could agree. Women should not be dying in childbirth. Right? So you find what you can agree on and say, this is what I'll work with. Right? Knowing that it's never going to be completely satisfying. But the work of an ambassador is the work with people who, by definition, there's a disagreement. Right? There's always somewhere progress can be made, but progress always happens in the midst of disagreement. And the work of an ambassador is not going to be done this side of the kingdom of God. Now, you might be thinking, well, Andy, your examples are a little bit high for the life I live. And you're right. Those are done by choice so that I can show the work of the imagination that I think is what we see in Daniel, what Paul is asking of us. And the principles, the practices are the same, even when it comes down to a lot of the life that we live, right? So even in the midst of division, maybe we can find things we do agree about. Maybe as a family that's divided, we can agree that we take care of the next generation. We might not be able to agree on much, but we can agree that we will make sure the next generation has what they need to move on. Maybe as a group of friends, we are divided, but we can make sure no one dies alone, right? Like, what is it that we can agree to? Maybe a group is so fractured they can't come together for a big family meal at the holidays anymore. But maybe they can get together in public the beginning of August every year, right? The work of an ambassador is inherently a work of imagination in the midst of disagreement, right? Imagining and seeking and figuring out what it is we do agree on and working towards that, knowing that in the midst of disagreement, there's always going to be something that's frustrating, something that's going to be a challenge. And so the work of the ambassador on behalf of Jesus Christ is to be inspired like Daniel, to be working towards the kingdom to come. And if Daniel can find ways to serve Babylon, then I think we can find ways to do something that are worth doing in our families, amongst our friends, in our communities, in our state, in our nation. We can find ways to move forward towards something worth doing while we hold on to the things that make us who we are. I'll work with anyone I can, and I will always say Jesus is Lord. Daniel would do anything he needed to do for Babylon, but he was always going to eat like a Jewish person, right? We work on what we can, we hold on to what makes us who we are. And in doing so, we're doing the good work of ambassadors of Jesus Christ in a world that sure does need it. Amen.